All right, I'd like to call to order the Board of County Commissioners Workshop for June 20th, 2023. I've got 2:33. The reason why we're a little late this afternoon is the commission meeting ran longer, but everything's on track, and we properly notified everybody at the commission meeting that we would be an hour late. So we're here now, and I'd like to introduce our county manager to introduce the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioners, we'd like to present you with this budget with the acknowledgement that this is going to be a different kind of year for us. We, for the last, 7-8 years, we have had consistent increases in property tax-based taxable values, been able to pay for most of your projects pay as you go. We've generated enough excess revenue in a variety of places to be able to do all of that. Because of the storm, which no one could have anticipated, no one could have anticipated the kind of loss of revenue losses we would experience. This 23-24 budget year really demands some pretty careful consideration in going forward. It's going to be about a little austerity. It's going to be about, I think, taking projects instead of doing in 1 year, maybe spreading them over a couple of years, and not just for us, but for others as well. So with that, with that sort of as, setting the context for this conversation, Pete, would you please begin?
Thank you, Roger. Good afternoon, Commissioners. So the question we're going to ask at the end is, how would you like to proceed with the budget? And what we're going to ask is a little indulgence from the board this budget season, because we're going to have to continue to work on it in July and in August. It's not quite as fully developed at this point as we have been in years past. A lot of that has to do with we've received all the requests from constitutionals, we've input all of the departmental budgets, and we have more in expenses than we do in recurring revenues. So there's a gap there, and we're going to have to continue to work on that gap or find strategies in order to fund that gap. And so this will take some work, maybe possibly going back to some constitutionals and departments asking for some strategies on how to, on how to proceed so that, we make everybody as satisfied as possible. Just briefly recapping, when we had a budget assumptions workshop May 2nd, our basic assumptions for building this budget was present the continuation budget, which is same service level next year as this year, what it costs to provide that. Obviously, rebuilding from Hurricane Ian is a top priority for our infrastructure, our parks, our traffic lights, et cetera, bridges. Use of excess reserves. At this point, we're not going to have excess reserves this year. So we do have some requests for kind of one-time capital items from some of the constitutionals that we'll have to look at, some strategies to fund that won't come out of excess reserves. And then, as I mentioned earlier, asking for some indulgence and some flexibility to make some changes later in the budget process, to do some more negotiating, kind of looking at more strategies to bring back to you so that we can finalize the budget in September. You've seen this many times, but right now we have a general fund budget, and the general fund is always the most complicated, most complex. $581 million, and this year we came into the year with $571 million of revenues. So, a slight gap there that was known. We knew we were going to have a gap. What we didn't know is on September 28th.
Real quick, Pete.
Yeah.
Go back one slide, if I may, just 1 second. So I just wanted to point out, you mentioned the negative 5.1 in 21-22 fiscal year and the 10.7 million in the year afterwards. We did that because if you look at the next column over on the ending reserve, we continued to build reserves. And we thought the best thing we could do for the taxpayers of Lee County is, instead of holding their money in a bank account and not using it, was to put it to work for them. And so that translates to that next column over, which says excess reserves invested. We intentionally wanted to invest the surplus that they had given us over the last several years, so that we used it to do much needed projects in their community. And so that's the reason why that's there. It's not because we were not balancing the budget or doing anything wrong with the money.
Correct.
Yeah.
We've had gaps before, and we've grown out of them quite quickly, within the coming year. This year's just an anomaly because, the costliest hurricane in Florida history hit us. So we have the June 1st property tax values. This is the taxable value, which is what the county is concerned with. This is what generates your property tax revenues, and your property tax revenues are your largest single revenue source in the general fund. And the increase June 1st is 5.2%, which is the lowest increase if you look back since 2013. So that's the lowest in a decade. And for an organization this size and a budget this size, I describe that, as I've told all you individually, as fairly anemic tax base increase, and that is all because of Hurricane Ian. And don't know what we'll see July 1st, but early indications is that it may not vary dramatically. And then in the lighter shade is the Revenue Estimating Conference, the last conference that was held at the state level, and that's their projections for Lee County at that time. So the June 1st values, this is what it translates into. That 5.2% generates $18.2 million of additional property tax revenues in the general fund. Now, there's other revenues in the general fund, and you'll see that some of those have increased. So, that's fairly low increase considering the increase in costs that we're experiencing. And then the unincorporated MSTU, which is all the unincorporated areas, all hazards, and library, actually did pretty well. They weren't nearly as impacted. General fund not only has Sanibel and Captiva and Fort Myers Beach and Bonita Springs in there. It has everything, whereas as well as some of the major impacted areas and the unincorporated areas like North Fort Myers, Iona, McGregor. Unincorporated MSTU does not include Sanibel and Fort Myers Beach, those cities, so you can see that did better. All hazards is just unincorporated Lee County and Cape Coral, and then library is a tax that is taxed everywhere except Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel, which have their own library districts. So when you take particularly Sanibel and Fort Myers Beach out, it's a much better picture.
Pete, would you go back to that slide for just a second, please? So, Commissioners, and the percent increase or decrease on the general fund, 5.21%. You'll recall for the last many years, previous property appraiser would give us our June 1 estimated taxable value, and then almost like the sun was coming up in the morning, when he got to the July 1 number, the July 1 property value increase, we would always pick up 1% or 2%. And Pete's had conversation with Mr. Caldwell, current property appraiser, and we are not anticipating a number greater than the 5.21%.
Commissioner Lane, yeah.
I agree with everything you said, Roger. He's also prefaces that there's a possibility that it to be lower. But I look at this in many ways as we sat around this room not long ago and talked about having really great reserves. I look at cities, certainly like Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel, that don't have any reserves left. And so this storm hit everybody in punches that you can't imagine. I look at the incorporated side of my district, and I look at the unincorporated side of my district, and I look at the unincorporated side being Captiva and being Boca Grande and Pine Island, and I'm looking at unincorporated at 9%. So even though the storm hit, pretty significant increase, relatively speaking. I think we're in a great place, and the 5.21 is about 8.6 was what we anticipated, so it's about 2.4 off are about $10 million off. And talking to Representative Constitutional Office, I'm sorry, I'm still dealing with this migraine. Constitutional Office Caldwell, we've issued over $29 million worth of refunds. So there's just some things I think we need to keep in content. This is going to be a cash flow exercise, but I think when I think of the storm and the hit we took from the storm, we're still in pretty good shape. All things considered, we have revenue streams, not only from revenue replacement, we have opportunities certainly to utilize some of our own funds to get us through this. So I understand what's before us. I just think we're going to have to be creative when it comes to cash flow. And, I think there's opportunities for us to fill some gaps. There's a way to do that, and there's certainly a conservative way to worry about next year as well. I'd like to get through this cycle. I think everyone here did a miraculous job getting us through the storm, but I look at the outcome and I look at us compared to other cities, and I think we're in a pretty good place.
Any other comments, commissioners?
I think that's going off what Kevin has said, because what we've done the last 10 years, I mean, Roger and your staff, the budgets you brought forward, we know what the budget was like 10 years ago compared to what it was the last 6 years. So I think we all agreed, obviously in the past, it was good to use some of the reserves to get it back out in the community, get the money being actively instead of holding the money in reserves for no reason. So there's a reason why we had it, and now obviously, but I think Roger said the next few years going forward is going to be a little bit different. We're not going to see the surplus we've seen the last 3 years. Obviously, the area grew so much more. The values went up so much the last 2 years because of what's happened locally and statewide. We're going to be okay, but it's definitely going to be a little bit different managing game as far as managing that. And hopefully, everybody else will be understanding that. We did some great raises last year and everything, and hopefully we can do the same thing now. It's just to the staff, to all the different constitutionals, but it's going to be a little bit different managing. Like Kevin says, a cash flow issue. But a lot of those costs are reoccurring, and that's something that's going to affect us in the future too.
All right, Pete, I think.
So, commissioners, we just to give you a picture of revenues in the general fund, we, like I said before, we had $570 million of revenues, and our projection is 612 million. So how do we get there? Because property taxes aren't the only revenue in the general fund. So we have that, we have the structural gap. Property taxes, as shown, increase of 18.2 million. Sales tax sharing, we're forecasting increasing 4 million. Revenue sharing from the state, 3 million. Interest earnings, of course, are up, just based on what's going on with the economy and interest rates. Grants, some of the grants are up, and $3 million of this grants in here is reimbursement we're receiving for the mass vaccination site we ran during COVID. We applied for reimbursement from FEMA, and that's coming through the next couple weeks for actual payment. Return from constitutionals has declined over the last couple of years. Other is kind of that difference between what we're seeing in electric franchise fees. They go into the general fund. We transfer those over to the unincorporated MSTU. But because the unincorporated MSTU is doing so well, is a lot healthier, we don't have to do quite as big a transfer. So the difference between what's coming in and that transfer generates some funding. And then for planning purposes, I know I've talked to you all about this, and this is just for planning purposes, but we've talked to DOT about it. The growth increment, what we've done is it looked for planning at least to suspend that for a year. We don't think that will have a major impact on maybe some out years in transportation. Also today, we had paused repaving immediately after the storm because we just had a lot of rebuild activities and actually just recovering from temporary repairs. But today the board approved several $1 million of road paving projects all throughout the county and Lehigh Acres, and that should take you through a good part of next year. So I don't think this is going to impact your road paving program because you're really kind of a year ahead, so to speak. And then you get that total of 42 million, which you add to the 570.
Pete, is that sales tax sharing number, is that a conservative forecast, or would you say that's?
So that is, no, we're forecasting 76 million. In 21-22, we're just under 72 million. That was a record year. This year we're running above that, but only a couple million at this point. So we're upping it by another couple million. The half-cent sales tax sharing is a formula. So even though this community is generating a huge amount of sales taxes going up to the state, that doesn't all come back down back to the county. It's not a one-to-one relationship like the local option sales tax is.
Okay, Commissioner Ruane?
Great, thanks, I appreciate that. And Pete's right. I mean, I think when you really track, and the Revenue Conference did a great job of tracking the sales tax, I think as we go to Tallahassee this upcoming year, at least in the cycle when we all went up, we were reminded just of the injury we had here, but also the economic stimuli that was injected into this economy, because we did inject 30% of the increase of $7 billion of sales tax revenue. And to Pete's point, we're not receiving it proportionally. But that's a great talking point if we could follow that, because I do think that we need to pivot and look at some strategies on maybe talking about some road projects and other things that we could potentially do to bring in the conversation. Because as we're going through our injury, it would be great if we could just have some greater portion of sales tax, but that's not available. I don't think there's any harm in reminding the legislator of exactly what we're contributing in that dollar amount, because we're not asking for anything other than maybe a more significant share of the sales tax we actually generated. Because when we tracked that, we were tracking 30% of $7 billion, which is $2.1 billion. So there's significant dollars that I think as we go and put together our team and our strategy, we might consider things outside the box that we hadn't before, maybe some items with Alico or some other items. I think we have nothing to lose, because as SBA continues to improve, as insurance proceeds continue to go out, our sales tax number is only going up. We certainly have those opportunities, and that's just something I'd love to keep track of, because that's a great talking point. Because again, it seems almost disingenuous to have so much money that we generate because we've been injured as we're rebuilding ourselves, and we can't have it just directly reinvested here.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, Commissioners, and then this is what the expense side looks like. I know this is a little busy, but the right-hand column is the key column here. At the top is the constitutionals in the general fund. The middle is the BOCC operating departments that are in the general fund, and then below are joint costs, so to speak, or state mandates. And I'm not calling out any specific budgets here for any reason, just to show you kind of the major increases. I will say that the constitutionals have built pay increases into their budgets, most around 5%, some 3%, with option of merit. I believe the sheriff's office is looking at about 12 or 13% increase, which ends up being about $22.5 million. So the sheriff has requested a $34 million increase. And the clerk has some increases there, a couple million. Medical examiner is a pretty big increase for that size of a budget, $2.6 million. But all in all, it's about a $42 million increase on the constitutional side. You saw we have total revenues of 42 to work with if we're just talking about recurring revenues. The BOCC departments came in around 5%. The outlier there is transit. If you look at that, during the pandemic, we received a lot of money from the federal government through the pandemic and through other programs related to the pandemic and American Rescue Plan. Those grants have gone away. We knew when we lowered that subsidy that it would have to go back up. And so we had to increase that from 16 million to 21.3 million. Transit systems throughout the country are suffering. The federal share is not increasing. The local shares are having to increase. And even though our ridership numbers are up, our costs certainly are going up, and the costs that go up are on the county side of things. And then you can see below, I'll just speak to debt service. Debt service, we're in a high debt service environment. The way those bonds were structured were large payments at the very end of the term. So we've got around 14, it'll be 15 million one year, but for the next 3 years. But the last payment we have on those bonds is October 1st, 2026. So after October 1st, 2026, that kind of $14 to $15 million tranche will go away. There'll be some capacity there. You can see we've suspended the growth increment, put that in 0, and then other things. The major part, the largest item being major maintenance. A lot of that has to do with buildings that we're renovating or building new. And I do want to point out that $24.5 million this year was actually $28.5, but remember we funded $4 million of that through excess reserves. So our major maintenance hasn't gone up as much. It was just how the way we were funding it. So you have expenses of $629 million. So when we put that all together, our revenues, I said earlier, are $613 million, expenses of $630 million roughly, and so right now we have a $17 million gap. As I showed you earlier, we're projecting undesignated reserves at the end of this year to be $93.8 million. So if you were to take that gap out of undesignated reserves, you end up with an adjusted reserve at September 30th, 2024 of $77 million. That's below your $85 million minimum, and the only thing I point out is that, these are recurring expenses. One thing I do want to point out on the undesignated reserves and that projection, we do know how much was paid in rebates, property tax refunds based on the October to December time frame, where if people's homes were basically uninhabitable or majorly damaged, they could apply for a refund from the property appraiser to certify that, and then the tax collector paid those refunds out, withheld what they would remit to us and paid those refunds out. And we know in the general fund that's going to be $5.3 million. So that's a loss in the general fund in the current year. Typically, we budget 95% of revenues in the general fund and receive 96%. So that's about $4 million. So that may offset to a certain extent. What I want to tell you is that and we have some other things in the general fund. Interest income's coming in higher. So I haven't adjusted this any from kind of the pure ending reserve that it is, because I think we will probably be close to that, but there's going to be some ups and downs there. But I haven't spent a lot of time trying to make any general assumptions on that until we get there. And that might be one strategy that we come back to you with, is that, on certain costs, maybe we take a look at where we end up, once we close the year out, and then say, okay, now we can add this back in. Because outside of this, there's about $12 to $13 million of either lost revenue or capital items that constitutionals are requesting that we typically pay out of excess reserves, but like I said, we don't have excess reserves this year. So I'm just giving you kind of the broad landscape of the general fund.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying the 70, roughly,
77.
rounding 77, is that a worst case scenario? Is that boiling down what you just said, a worst case scenario, or are you saying it could be worse?
I'll tell you this, that I've been much more aggressive with revenues than we have in the past. Mm-hmm. Although we've been fairly aggressive with, we have not under budgeted revenues, and we've been as aggressive as we can without kind of giving you a false picture of like, well, yeah, we're going to generate all this revenue when that's unlikely to happen. So I feel comfortable that that we won't necessarily exceed that revenue number by much. The expenses are what they are. We budget that. Now we don't typically spend all of all of our budgets. But I can tell you last year in 21-22, and there was a mid-year salary adjustment in there, but last year I believe we spent 98% of our budgets. We were only under budget by about 2%.
You may be about to answer this, but does this scenario here that you're showing us on this slide have a salary increase for our county employees built?
No, it does not. So the only thing that's not in the previous slide is there's not a salary increase there. I didn't put that in before having a discussion with the board. For comparative purposes, a 5% in the general fund for Lee County employee salaries would be $3.25 million.
5% is $3.25 million?
Yes, in the general fund.
Sorry, Commissioner Ruane, I apologize, I was writing.
No problem, no problem. So 77 million is there any way of putting together a cash plus and or minus item so we can quantify the so many moving parts that we have, so we have an appreciation where we are? I mean, $77 million, considering we're going to be at 85, doesn't give me great consternation when I look at others. When I look at properties that continue to sell in 23. But is there any way to come up with, as you go through the various cash adjustments you need to make? Because at the end of the day, this is a cash adjustment puzzle we have to solve, okay? The pluses and minuses. Decisions like, do we use the $25 million we talked about this morning, and how much? Do we prefer and defer growth increment funding? The 5% that I am adamant that staff receives, with no doubt, potentially, looking at 2020 and maybe doing some cash flow borrowings internally. I mean, can we look at just net cash on things that we do so we can quantify what are our priorities and what can we potentially say they're not in the top 5 or top 10? I mean, in organizations I've run, this isn't something unusual. You go into, I've never gone through a hurricane, but the pandemic was probably as close to anything I've ever seen where revenues in my companies were shut off completely. So how do I get through the storm, if you will? And the storm right now, I think we all can indicate that it seems like the 40% in Fort Myers Beach won't be 40% next year is a negative. The 30% in Sanibel won't be 30%. So if I could just put a list in a simple way of what cash flow, what impacts these 20 things have, if you will. And then maybe as a board, prioritize those and say, okay, how do we get through this cash flow situation? And I'm probably one, from my point of view, and I sat down with Roger and Pete and certainly Dave and kind of gave them my thoughts, but I'm kind of one that looks at pluses and minuses when it comes to what's going to drain cash flow and kind of put them in priorities. And I want to get through today. I think everyone in this room did exactly what we wanted them to do and then some. And it might be, hey, we're going to do this today, and maybe tomorrow I won't have the opportunity. But if I could have a quick list to identify those things, because I think there's opportunities to utilize cash flow that we currently have, look at potentially things that may be draining of cash flow, like growth increment funding. Opportunities where, do we have enough applications currently in 2020 and we might look to tap that for a little bit? I mean, again, I honestly, looking across the region, think that $77 million is a pretty good number to be at. And I am definitely one commissioner that just wants to look at those items to say, how do we get through this cash crunch? That's, I mean, to me, that's the way I look at this.
Any other questions? I had one more, but yeah, Commissioner Sandelli. Yeah, hit your.
Obviously, the hurricane made a substantial difference in this whole financial picture. When you're looking at, and we're just starting the hurricane season now, Pete, what kind of provisions are we making should we have, unfortunately, another instance? And what is our ability going forward to cover some of those expenses? Am I asking it the wrong way?
Well, I'm not sure exactly the question is.
Well, our reserves are not what they used to be,
Right.
correct? Okay. I haven't heard any discussion on what our reserves potentially could be, given the fact that we might have another occurrence, and how we cover that. Are we making any provisions along those lines?
For two major hurricanes in a row, I'll be honest with you, no. But obviously, like anything else that we've experienced, whether it's the recession or COVID or whatever, we kind of know the process we need to go through if we have to start to make cutbacks or have unforeseen expenses.
I realize it's unforeseen, but it could happen again.
Right. Yeah.
And it's impacted us tremendously, so does that, whatever provisions we make, does that help us mitigate potential loss in the future should we have another occurrence of some sort?
Yeah. I mean, Commissioner, honestly, 2 years in a row like that, when we get reimbursed by FEMA for everything that we're going to get reimbursed for, we will be in a lot better situation. But we have sizable reserves in some funds for hurricanes. The most obvious example is solid waste. We carry a large reserve in solid waste and have for years as a disaster recovery concept, and we've used a lot of that this year after Ian. We've already spent a good $60 million out of solid waste reserves, and we're really just monitoring that on a day-to-day basis for cash flow. Now, we have a $150 million line of credit. As Commissioner Ruane said, we're going to have a $25 million interest-free loan from the state that we can tap, and I've tried to keep up to this point everything interest-free, just so that we don't incur more costs. We get reimbursed for it, but reimbursement can take years. You can see with the vaccination site, it's been several years before we get full reimbursement. But yeah, two years in a row, I don't have a plan that's for that exactly, other than you work the situation.
Commissioner, I'd like to ask the same question, but I'd like to ask it just a little bit different way. Pete, do you remember how much of the general fund reserves, have we used in Hurricane Ian recovery so far?
In Ian, we have used, I believe, $14 million in the general fund.
Okay.
I'll have to go back and take a look at the weekly report we do.
And is that money that is going to be reimbursed someday, or is that money that's just gone, we spent it to respond to Hurricane Ian?
No, it'll be reimbursed.
Could be reimbursed someday, okay.
Yes.
So let me ask, how much?
And that's a cash flow issue, so I'm not really, that's not incorporating these numbers because some of that cash flow is separate.
Yeah, so I'm saying, so we've got, this 93.7 million number, right? If we didn't have to respond to Hurricane Ian, would that number have been 100 million, or would it still be 93.7? How much of it?
It'd still be 93.8 million.
Okay, so we really didn't spend down general fund reserves to respond to Hurricane Ian? Right.
No, because the general fund is a pooled cash account, you can have cash flow capacity, outside your budgeted number. At some point, those two have to reconcile.
Okay, so
at some point, I may have to put that on the line of credit or on the $25 million loan, but within a fiscal year, I don't have to do that right away.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about, so if we go into the next budget year with call it 72 million after some other adjustments and things like that, if we go in there with 72 million, if we were to get hit by another storm and we had to tap that 72 million as our rainy day fund, we just came out of Ian and you're telling me we didn't really tap the 93 for Ian. You don't believe?
Can I ask it differently?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, Pete, we left here last year at $85 million in reserves.
Right.
We go through a process of having excess reserves built. I saw in the booklet today, we're at 96, and we approved some items that took this down to 93. So we go through a process of building excess reserves. So we do get a high point, and we do spend those excess reserves.
Correct.
We don't just have as much capacity, but theoretically, had we not had those expenses, we'd have a greater number called excess reserves that obviously would be different on this page. Is that a fair statement?
Well, this 93.8 million is basically a projection from when we closed last year, when we closed all the books, and then we brought forward our projected revenues and our projected expenses. It does not incorporate the hurricane.
But we spent today $2.8 million. We're at 96 to 93, did we not?
Yeah, we had excess reserves of around 98 million, and we reduced it by 4 million for what's going to be the county's match for the waterway debris cleanup. For NCRS is picking up the other 80%, I believe. Now that'll be a local match that we should be able to get reimbursed from the state. So
I guess my point is that we get to a certain point where we take the 85 when we leave here and we let excess reserves go and we utilize them as it goes up and down. So I'm just trying to understand our reserves, understand the cash disbursements that we make, because I think your point is valid, Commissioner Hammond. What we've done is actually identified this, and some of the items may be reimbursable. So if it is reimbursable, the anemic 76 may be 80. So I'm just trying to find a way. Again, what I'm trying to do is look at cash flow and understand this. And to me, to understand all the reserves that we have, to have an appreciation for what was the high point of where we got to undesignated reserves and how high they got to, what we actually spent. And then we could have this list as I vision to try to say, okay, here's really where cash went. We went here, here's where we spent, here's some items for reimbursement. I'm just trying to get my arms around, this is a cash flow crunch. I don't think it of any other way. And I think providing clarity, and I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we're going to try to make some decisions here. And I think the priority, no different than what we did in transportation, is to say, what are our priorities? And I think the question you asked is one that intrigued me, because as we were preparing for today, I saw it at a higher number, and then we utilized that. So what other times did we do that today, and yesterday, and the day before, and understanding what opportunities are available to us? And I appreciate Commissioner Sandelli's question, what happens if another reserve does? There's a balancing act of recognizing that these reserves are our constituents' money. And what we're trying to do is balance cash flow. And that's what I look at this exercise right now. I mean, that's just in my mind of how I've gone through, I've done this is my 18th budget. So I've seen the worst, 07, 08, 09, I've seen a pandemic. So, and listen, all things considered, when the storm happened, we're 9 months into the storm. Peter's done a wonderful job of managing cash flow in a way that we haven't incurred a dime of interest and expense. We've utilized our own money. So we don't have some of the things that other municipalities have done. I'm just trying to understand in and outs, if that makes sense, Pete.
Yeah. And Commissioners, that's what we're really looking for today, is those suggestions for strategies that then we can come back to you in August to kind of show you, here's kind of the cafeteria of options for you in order to deal with, with some of this gap, whether it's a recurring gap or a non-recurring gap.
Pete, thank you. Great presentation so far. I had a couple of questions. In the past, I know we had extra funds. We enhanced budgeting funding for human services, for example, and also we've been doing the $5 million extra for years now for repaving in Lehigh. I know we talked before, the paving part of it element, we're already behind because there's not enough labor and material anyway to get ahead. So I think, does this budget reflect that, take away that $5 million this year for that?
Yeah, yes it does, because I've already suspended the growth increment.
And how about the, in the past, we've done some extra funding to different departments, like one was like human services, we increased funding the last 2 years, I believe, to try to fill those gaps for services.
We have not done anything with that funding.
So that is not including have extra funding for that. It's going back to what we were, the baseline services.
We've made no
Thank you.
changes to that.
Looks like your next slide, you're going to move into unincorporated MSTU. So before we leave the general fund, any other discussion, commissioners, or Pete, any other information, direction you're looking for?
No, Commissioner Wayne came up with some ideas for us that we can come back and give you what it looks like, what the various options are. There's not going to be any one thing that's going to, that's going to solve all the issues we may have. We'll come to you with a whole, list of potential options.
And I appreciate that, Pete. I think you've done a great job. I'm just trying to understand. I think it's going to be, 5 nickels to get to a quarter. I don't think there's one item that's going to get us there, but I'd like to understand 2 dozen items and just have some clarity in that regard. And we put priorities. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we're going to do, is make priorities. And I think to Commissioner Pendergrass's point, I think we all need to be aware of, and one of the balances you have in this environment is not only is cost going up, but timelines are taking longer. I order a dock and they tell me it's 14 months. I order a roof, it's 14 months. So the capital improvement number may be something we want to achieve, but can we actually execute it? Because I can't put it in this year's budget anyway. And if we budget it, and we can't utilize it, are there other opportunities where we have things that we can do and utilize? And those are the types of things I'm looking for. And I know I'm getting too far into the weeds, and I apologize. Considering I have a migraine, it's a miracle.
All right. I think we're ready to move into the unincorporated MSTU.
All right, Commissioners, the unincorporated MSTU is, essentially flat. Little bit of increase, 1.5 million, but that's not much of an increase for a fund that size. It's also one of our larger funds, and the revenue side of that looks much better. I do have a little bit of a structured gap in there for a reason, because we're sending a little bit. Holy cow. We're sending a little bit less of franchise fee revenues over to the unincorporated MSTU because our reserves were more than $11 million at the end of this year. What we're projecting, that's a really healthy reserve for the unincorporated MSTU. We could spend that down a little bit. So this gap is really an intended spend down of that. And if we were to do a pay increase, that might be a little bit more, but you would still have a very healthy reserve for a fund that size. Then, okay, this is the capital. So this is usually paid through with excess reserves. The capital side of things, we do know that there's a couple. We just have to make these payments. Sheriff's radios. This is the 1.4 million that we pay each year on the financing that we did for all of the sheriff's analog to digital radio system. All the radios that the deputies and personnel have. The election supervisor is asking for $240,000 for an express vote machines. Those are tap screen tabulators, voting machines in each precinct, and this is in preparation of the presidential primary next spring, and then also the general election next fall. The clerk has requested some revenue replacement based on some of his revenues from recording and other revenues being down, and he was wanting to use those funds for some IT items. And this is something we could look at also. Maybe we look at, where we're trending during the year, and if we need to, increase the clerk's transfer of funds, his draws on his budget throughout the year, we can kind of monitor if those revenues have rebound and make that adjustment during the year. And then the sheriff's office typically asks for about $10 million of capital each year. We don't have excess reserves this year, so maybe we take a look at some strategies potentially, like we did incorporate some ARPA funds into the general fund to pay for EMS salaries a few weeks ago, and we could look at maybe using some of those funds for the sheriff's capital, because I know public safety is a you know.
Commissioner Pendergrass?
Pete, I have a quick question, just to make sure everything's straight. So the other considerations for the sheriff and the clerk's revenue, so the revenue replacement, is that reflection of the 30, because the clerk's asked on the one page, 35% increase in budget? Does that 2.3 part of revenue replacement, is that part of that 35% increase, or is that separate?
If you added this 2.3 million to the 2 million the clerk is asking for, that would be going from 12.3 million to 16.6 million. That's about.
That would be, yeah, it would be reoccurring, so, okay. Of that 35%, how much of that salary increases he's proposing?
The clerk is, I believe the clerk has a 3% salary increase with
Okay.
an option for up to an additional 2%.
Okay.
Merit, is that correct?
So the other percentages for other IT and other expenses? Okay, thank you. So it's not reoccurring, the 35% is not total reoccurring for next year?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So what's your strategy on this, Pete? How would we cover this?
I think some of this we can cover through ARPA funding that we use to pay for EMS salaries in the general fund, because those salaries, that's called presumptive public safety, those salaries had already been budgeted. So a portion of that could be paid from that, and we can come back with some other strategies. I don't have a whole list, but I'll have a list for you in July or August, depending on what your sensitivity is to fully funding all this.
Commissioner Ruane?
Last item, when we had our briefing, and I know we quickly did the ARPA, but if you can completely give every thought that you could think of in utilizing those capacities to give us some relief, not only just in some of these areas, but if there's any other opportunities or it's decreasing a particular area like EMS, I mean, just so I have a greater appreciation. That was in our briefing, I thought, some opportunities to give us some type of relief in the budget and certainly the capital outlays. Is that a fair?
Yeah, and I think there's a whole slew of things that we can do come back to you with, and that could include,
Wonderful.
Asking some of the constitutionals and even departments, are there certain things you can phase? Mm-hmm. Also, we can look at the ARPA. We can certainly look at things to get that. The only caution I have with the gap is it's recurring. So even though we're at 77 million next year, you still have a $16 million gap, and you got to make sure that you have reoccurring revenues for that. Now, I think the tax base will go up much more next year than it did this year, based on all the rebuilding that's happening after January 1st, and then. And then we can look at some of the loans that we have also, and we could look at potentially some capital projects that maybe we're not going to start on the same timetable that we thought we would.
Can I ask, what is the all hazards fund for? What's the balance of it, and did we use any of that for Ian?
Yes, we've used, but we really don't have a reserve in there anymore. I mean, we have spent all those funds. Now they're going to be reimbursed, but that may take some time. So at the same time that we have a recurring budget that we're dealing with, we also have all this cash flow that we've got to match up with the repairs we're making, and then the timing of when we're going to get reimbursement for that. So you've got these two things kind of going on at once, and you don't want to mix and match them too much. The all hazards fund reserve, we've spent more than we have within the year. Now we'll have to correct that by year end, and we'll have to put some of those on a line of credit until we get reimbursed.
Can we get an overall list of reserves where we're at? That would be really helpful. I know you said solid waste, but just an overall snapshot, whatever, if if it's March, April, May, whatever, just to give us some type of indication. Maybe if you just have like where we ended up in September and where we are, whatever the easiest is for you to give us an indication, so we at least have some appreciation for that.
And we could look at some interfund loans.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Great job, Pete.
So Commissioners, August 1st is the second draft. We'll probably still be working on this, and then the final draft, which I'm pretty sure we'll have it all finalized August 15th, and then your public hearings in September. So based on, the direction you've given, we'll come back with kind of a list of potential options or combination of options, because I think we're going to have to do a combination of things to get us through the next year.
All right, anything else, Commissioners, you want to add? No? You like the schedule? Everybody's happy with
Great.
that?
Great job.
That's fun. Well, good. I think everybody seems to be okay with that schedule then, and the assumptions made so far, and yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to add? No? All right, with that, Mr. County Manager, back to you.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, that was a good conversation today and provides the sort of guidance that we need to for the next round of discussions and adjustments to the budget, and they will see you then.
All right. All right, well then, if there's no further business before us, then we're adjourned. I'll see you at 5 o'clock.